Nice.
All right. And I think we are live here on Facebook for the Gestalt IT Rundown. We're going to get the show started in just a moment. Tom, it's been a big week so far of IT news. Are you ready?
I am ready. I got this.
All right. I have music all queued up. This is all official. The big red background is all red and ready, and we're ready to go. So let's get the ball rolling. Hello, all, and welcome to the Gestalt IT Rundown, your weekly look at the IT news of the week, brought to you by Gestalt IT. I'm your host, Rich Stroffolino, editor with the aforementioned Gestalt IT, and joining me from across this great land of ours, he's the man, the plan, the canal. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Hollingsworth. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Rich. I'm going to be enjoying a nice chocolate chip cookie later because it is National Chocolate Chip Day.
Wow. You could also have some ice cream. Maybe, what else do you do chocolate chips with? I don't know. I mean, anything with them is better. And maybe Cisco could use some chocolate chips because they could certainly use a better day. Security researchers at Red Balloon found two major security exploits for Cisco's 1001X router. The first is a vulnerability for the iOS, the operating system that runs on it, that would allow someone to remotely gain root access. So already really bad. From their researchers, we were able to get around Cisco's Trust Anchor via an FPGA exploit. If you're not familiar with that, that's basically their version of Secure Enclave, or it's kind of their single point of security validation, I guess. And no one can access the code to it. It's supposed to be very secure and totally locked down. This would allow actors to make changes to the device, but still have it report back as working properly when everyone went to go check on it. Really, really bad. Cisco has announced a patch for the iOS exploit, but it will be months before it's released and require an on-premises reprogramming. They actually said on-premise. We're going to allow them that. AKA, it can't be just pushed remotely. You have to actually physically go to the device that's affected. And presumably, this would affect more than just this one specific router, considering iOS runs on any number of devices. Cisco and Red Balloon are disputing the nature of the Trust Anchor exploit, but are we seeing cracks and kind of putting all our security eggs in a trusted enclave basket, Tom?
Well, I think what happened here is that Cisco really does believe that this Trust Anchor thing is going to work. The problem is that Red Balloon spent $80,000 of their own money. These routers retail for 10 grand each. And they just started playing around with them. And what they would do is they would boot the router in ROM-MON mode, which is the secure, no operating system found mode. And the Trust Anchor does exactly what it's supposed to at that point. It waits about 300 seconds and then it shuts the router off because it thinks it's being exploited. So what they did is they just started disabling pins on the FPGAs until they found the one that controlled the call home feature to shut the router down. And then they just said to disable it. So that's why this has become a huge deal, is because now with FPGAs being field programmable, you can rewrite anything you want in there and it's not going to be able to call home and shut the router down. So this is a big deal because it's kind of proving the fact that maybe FPGAs are by design not the best thing to use for trusted enclave type things.
Yeah, you can certainly see there's a certain convenience factor to that when it comes to manufacturing and kind of putting them into the hardware. But yeah, having people fool around with it, I suppose. I mean, not that Cisco has a wide enough footprint that I hope they're not assuming this, but maybe that the cost of entry would limit the amount of people that could fool around with this. But yeah, now that this is out there, pretty nasty stuff. And again, the fact that this isn't something that they can just flick a switch and release a patch and everything is patched all together. If you're dealing with any kind of remote deployments, I mean, this specific router, probably you're not going to have too many of those, right? These are, more campus routers, or what is the focus of?
These are more designed to be service provider backbone routers, which I think is one of the things that causes a little bit of pause here, because if you can backdoor that FPGA, you can see pretty much everything that's flying across that router. That's a problem because that's persistence. That's not just a break-in, that's a stay-in.
Yeah, at least, I mean, but what my point is that at least the patch for this specific router, theoretically, you have the staff and you have the access to be able to do that relatively easily. Although, again, not being able to do it remotely or push it through the air is kind of a pain. So we will see what the fallout from this is, and how long it actually takes them to get this patch out there.
Yeah.
All right, next up, in other terrifying security news, Hey, it's another year, another fundamental security flaw for Intel chips. This time, the security researchers that brought you Spectre and Meltdown are back with ZombieLoad, a side channel attack made up of 4 separate design flaws. The exploit effectively allows application data to bleed across boundaries when trying to access a buffer on the CPU. Researchers found a proof of concept allowing for real-time viewing of websites visited. Just by using this exploit. So not just theoretical, actually at least being used in a proof of concept. The exploit can be triggered in VMs and also, for cloud instances, and affects all Intel systems going back to 2011. So effectively, any kind of modern core architecture is going to be impacted by this. Intel has started to roll out patches across a wide swath of different architectures going back at least to Haswell from what I saw, with consumer devices slowed down 3% and data center workloads looking at closer to a 9% performance drop. Tom, again, another, is this just x86 has this long history of, for being as long in the tooth as it is, even though it's been updated, refreshed endless times by Intel. Is this just the future that Intel has now with x86, that the not the code base, but the architectural history is so long that, and been extended upon so long that these kind of flaws are inevitable?
Yeah, this is, well, I mean, when you look at how they originally got Spectre and Meltdown to work, it was branch prediction exploiting essentially, and this just builds on that. And coming from the same team, it's not surprising. They found a weakness in the architecture, and they're going to exploit it for everything that it's worth. And in a way, I kind of feel like that's a good thing, because it does expose some fundamental flaws, but it also forces us to rethink this all-out speed race. It used to be that Moore's Law was being held in check because we were seeing these advances. And then when it became an issue with Intel wanting Moore's Law to be true every year, they started doing more and more of these little tricky things to make the chips go faster. And now the Piper is coming back to collect his payment, as it were, just because this is a really bad problem in the name of speed.
Yeah, and to put it into context, the researchers said, kind of in the how apocalyptically bad is this? They said, I think it's worse than Spectre, but not quite as bad as Meltdown, and kind of falling also within the same spectrum of ease of being able to exploit it. This isn't none of these flaws, these fundamental flaws from Intel are the easiest to exploit. Like a phishing attack is always going to be, or any kind of social engineering is always going to be like orders of magnitude easier. However, for virtually impenetrable systems, this may be, a viable for, more sophisticated actors, that kind of stuff. From a enterprise perspective, again, the same thing with Meltdown that we saw. This is something that, VM isolation or, using a cloud provider doesn't really provide you any protection for it. I mean, is that going to be any kind of influence when it comes to, public cloud providers making long-term investments in hardware?
Yeah, it's going to make them go back to Intel and say, fix this or we're dumping you. I mean, that's really all that there is, because right now your options are patch it and lose performance, or wait until the next thing comes along the pipe that causes this to become an even bigger problem. So I'm sure that, when you're an Amazon or a Microsoft, you're looking at your partner Intel and going, all right, seriously, guys, fix this now.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing, now we heard this before, I think with Meltdown, that AMD and ARM are not affected. I mean, ARM wouldn't be affected. This seems to be very x86 specific. I'm interested to see if there, we see an AMD variant of that down the road, and we kind of saw that with Meltdown initially, where it was originally just an Intel thing, and then no, it turns out everything's broken forever. So we will see how that plays out. And then finally, in our trio of just horrible security news this week, Microsoft released a patch for remote desktop services for Windows XP, Windows 7, Windows Server 2003, and 2008 to protect against a vulnerability that affects devices pre-authentication with no interaction needed. If you're hearing those names of different versions of Windows, you may realize that several of them are no longer supported and shouldn't be getting patches. That's how bad this exploit was. Microsoft did it, kind of out of band, out of support. Very interesting there. The exploit is wormable, and the researchers compared it to the WannaCry ransomware and able to spread quickly across devices. So it kind of explains why Microsoft is kind of anxious to patch this, especially on older systems that probably don't have great security anyway. Windows 8 and Windows 10 are not vulnerable, so that's good. And with now market share kind of tipping into the Windows 10, into the majority of Windows 10 devices being out there, that's at least a good thing. And there have been no active uses of the exploit seen in the wild. But Microsoft warned it's only a matter of time to reverse engineer the patches before that becomes a very real possibility. Tom, will Microsoft have to update Windows XP for the rest of time? And does this really justify the kind of the Windows 10 continuous deployment or continuous update kind of strategy?
I mean, I kind of like the fact that Microsoft is using this as an example to tell people to get off of a version of Windows that was released in 2002. For those of you that are paying attention at home, if you were born that year, you're going to graduate from high school next year. And they're still wanting people to patch this. That's crazy talk. I mean, the architecture is completely different inside of Windows. That's why 8 and 10 aren't affected by this. You need to get off of those versions of Windows. And Microsoft is basically doing their due diligence so that the ATMs of the world don't get blasted by this. And I was actually working on a support desk when the SQL Slammer worm came out. So I know how bad it is when you have a rapidly spreading exploit with no patch for it. And let me tell you, that was not a fun night on the support desk. But more importantly, you have to examine your desktop strategy, and you have to understand that Microsoft is not going to take a one-off for your 17-year-old operating system anymore. You need to wisen up, and you need to be ready to move when something like this comes out next time.
I mean, but with millions of XP machines still out there, still being used, like you said, kind of for the back ends of ATMs, point of sale machines, other things where people aren't even thinking about what operating system it's being run, or in mom and pop shops, that kind of stuff. Is Microsoft in just a no-win situation in the long run here? Because at some point, you're absolutely right. A worm like this is going to come out, and they're going to go, you know what? We've updated Windows XP. The guy that we have that just sits in a cubicle and waits for horrible security exploits that knows the code base. We let him go, or he retired or whatever. At some point, they're going to say, we're not releasing a patch for XP. And then Microsoft gets all this bad publicity that Microsoft abandons users, worm spreads, further worldwide. Microsoft didn't do anything to stop it. And again, I know a lot of people aren't crazy about the kind of the Windows 10 forced march of updates. They've kind of eased off that a little bit. But I feel like that's the only way going forward, with more devices being interconnected, with more of these exploits only going to be coming out every year, every month, every week. That's the only way forward for the company, right?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Microsoft really can't win here. Either they dedicate their resources to making things safe and modernized, or they keep around the tiger team of XP security exploit folks. and those guys are going to be drawing a pension until they're 90 at the rate they're going.
Yeah. In non-Windows news, in the most non-Windows-ness of news, Tom, you know what 2019 is supposed to be the year of, right? Not VDI.
Let me check my calendar. Is it Linux on the desktop?
It may be, because at Google I/O, the company announced that all Chromebooks released in 2019, ARM or Intel based, will be Linux ready out of the box. Users can now launch a Debian 9.0 Linux container in terminal, with options to use either Fedora or Ubuntu, with just a few shell commands to kind of switch things over. Canary builds now also allow for easy file sharing between Chrome OS and Debian, and it should be coming to the general release relatively soon. Chrome OS already Linux based, certainly, but there's it's very much obscured behind basically just being a big Chrome window that you can use. But 2019, the year of Linuxier Linux on the desktop, Tom, what do we think?
I think this is a bunch of hooey, to be honest with you. And here's the reason why. People who use a Chromebook don't care about Linux or Windows or Mac. They care about Google. They want to be able to use their Google apps. They want to be able to do Google searches. I mean, the biggest deployments of Chromebooks that I've seen are schools. And the secondary ones are road warriors who just don't like iPads. But here's the biggest thing. I mean, if what we're calling Linux on the desktop now is being able to run a bash shell inside of a terminal window, then by all accounts, Windows 10 will be able to do that at the next update. So don't stick feathers up your butt and call yourself a chicken. This is not Linux. This is Linux-like capability inside of something that is still very Chrome OS. Now, I'll tell you that Chrome OS under the hood is very much Linux. But that's the issue that we run into, is that Linux on the desktop is not what you and I would consider Linux. It's a pretty shell in front of it. So, okay, big deal.
as someone who in the mid aughts went through my Linux hippie, college phase and was like, I should just install this on every machine. No one will ever have any complaints about this. The idea now that Linux has mass market penetration across a number of OSs in terminal as the way to go forward is this very bizarre world to live in. I do think that some of this announcement was literally just to get the attention of tech press that still that are the Linux diehards, that just to get this story to write up. I do think it's really cool. I mean, again, Chrome OS it is Linux based from its very beginning. The CR48 that Google put out had like a little developer switch you could flip, and then you could install whatever you wanted on it. And so there's always been this weird not tension, I mean, certainly, but been ways to kind of backdoor into getting a full Linux install. But I do have to say, if you are a command line dork, if there are some instances where a Chromebook is very tempting to me, but there are those instances, okay, yeah, you can run Android apps, and that fills in some of the gap that you can't get between web apps and a more traditional desktop experience, maybe by opening up to some interesting command line utilities. I think that has some interesting possibilities. All right. Other interesting possibilities at the Samsung Foundry Forum event, which is kind of hard to say. Samsung announced that using gate all-around transistor designs, the company will begin test runs of 3 nanometer chips in 2020, with mass production expected in 2021. They expect the shrink will speed performance by 35% and reduce power by 50%. This uses flat nanosheet transistor channels with a 3D gate wrapped all around it, instead of just being like a sheet on top as more traditional or transistors have been done kind of to date. The tech opens the door for the potential of transistors below 1 nanometer. Considering that a silicon atom has a diameter of 0.2 nanometers, Tom, and I looked that up, are we surprised at this that these processes have gotten this small for chips?
No, this is the march ever downward. Let's make the smallest transistor that we can find and pack as many of them on a regular sized SoC as we can. Because that's the thing. The SoCs don't get any smaller. They just pack more and more transistors on there. I mean, when you look at the size of your standard mobile device, aside from the iPhone SE, they haven't been getting smaller. What we've been doing is we've been adding processor power to them, which negates the power savings and speed performance and things like that. So I'm not overly excited about this, because I mean, we've known this for a long time. Now the technology behind it is really amazing when you know that they have to do things like shock isolate the buildings that these are being made in, because literally traffic on the road outside the building can cause errors in the wafer manufacturing process. I looked that up too. And that's at 10 nanometers, and we're already 3 times smaller than that. So
it is interesting, though. There will be, I mean, obviously, with any new investment in any new chip process, that's a huge upfront investment for the fab that they put that in. That's why so many companies go fabless, is because they don't have tens of billions of dollars to put down every 3 years to build a new fab in Germany or Hong Kong or whatever. So, but they did say on a cost basis, even after taking out the initial capital investment, these will be more expensive to produce, because this is a very obviously, to get down to 3 nanometers, it's a very precise technology. I do wonder if that will impact yields, especially because the first round of these chips is supposed to be going into smartphones, wearables, that kind of stuff, things that are produced in the tens of millions, hundreds of millions kind of volume. Obviously, Samsung is no stranger to this. They kind of spun out their foundry business in their weird Samsung portfolio of businesses that are all owned by Samsung, but all compete viciously with each other at the same time. So I have to imagine, if they're comfortable announcing this, they have to be reasonably assured that they can make everything work at scale and have the customers to use this with. But they were predicting that they're at least a year ahead of TSMC and at least 2-3 years ahead of Intel. Intel can't even deliver on 10 nanometer. I think they have one chip out that can do that right now. Nothing on the server side. And we should be seeing, by the way, so like the 3 nanometer launch is going to be consumer focused for 2021. And I think 2022, 2023 going to be getting to more data center IoT use cases to see that as well. But interesting stuff nonetheless. And Tom, we're going to finish out with a little acquisition news. Have you heard of this company called VMware?
Name rings a bell. I think they do something with software, right?
Yeah, it's a video motionware. They do some graphic smoothing technology. But VMware announced the acquisition of BitNami, the application packaging platform. According to BitNami CEO Daniel Lopez, the company was doing a fundraising round and realized that building an enterprise sales force was kind of hard, and the acquisition kind of grew out of there initially just from a funding round. VMware is committing to maintaining BitNami's existing cloud provider relationships and plans to use them to deliver validated solutions to customers in multiple clouds, formats, and marketplaces. That's a quote. BitNami is a bit of a developer darling. Good move by VMware here, Tom?
Yeah, I think this is because it allows them to augment their cloud offerings. Because the two biggest announcements that we've seen from VMware recently were VMware on AWS and VMware on Azure, and everyone's like, well, then why would I not just run natively on those two platforms and cut VMware out of the middle and lower my costs? Well, now with BitNami, what they can say is, well, we have application packaging, and that will help you out quite a bit. So this is a value add to keep their cloud offering relevant, whether you're running on VMware's hybrid cloud solutions or if you're running VMware on a public cloud. This kind of makes it sticky. And the idea is that you build up the services and you cause the developers to want to continue to use things like VMware BitNami or whatever they end up calling it. And now they're not going to want to go native AWS because they're going to miss out on some of their tool sets.
Yeah, I do think this is an interesting move by VMware to kind of go from courting the companies that developers work for to getting into, a more developer direct relationship, much the way that the public cloud, kind of to your point, Tom, much the way the public cloud providers do that in a lot of ways, instead of going, oh, I'll describe this S3 bucket and I'll spin up, my EC2 instance or whatever. Instead, now I can just, the only reason I was doing that was so I could run WordPress, right? Or I could run Drupal, or I could run this one app. And that's why I need this cloud server. Instead of that, now you have this direct relationship with VMware via BitNami to spin all that up. And yeah, the cloud stuff handles it in the background. I don't have to worry about it. It does maybe signal a more direct developer / almost not a consumer level, but away from more of an infrastructure idea of the company, or at least diversifying into that area, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably what it's going to end up looking like when this all settles.
Let me just put it this way. I can spin up a BitNami WordPress install and get that working in a couple of minutes. So I do think that has some interesting implications for diversifying the type of people that could be considered VMware customers, which I think is good for the long-term viability of the company. Again, BitNami kind of being a I called it a developer darling, but it's the company you go to when you say, oh, I just need this spun up in 2 minutes. I don't care about any of the background stuff. Is there any chance that any like developer goodwill is VMware kind of seeing as the 800-pound gorilla coming in and buying them up, or will that depend on how they handle them post acquisition?
It's going to depend entirely on how this handles post acquisition. VMware has done some really good things recently with some of their acquisitions. So I feel like if they kind of treat this with kid gloves, basically look at the way Microsoft treated GitHub. You do that, you're gonna have developers eating out of your hand.
Very, very interesting. And Tom, thank you for feeding us from the hand of your IT knowledge. Always appreciated. Where can people find more of your good stuff if they are so inclined?
Man, I am all over the internet at this point. The quickest ways to find me, head over to my Twitter handle, Networking Nerd. That's real-time streaming snarkiness. I write at networkingnerd.net. I also write at gestaltit.com, where Rich edits all of my loveliness and makes it sound coherent.
Well, we try. You can also find some of my stuff at gestaltit.com as well. You can also check out the On-Premise IT Roundtable podcast. We just had a new episode all about data protection policy, so you can check that out. Was a really interesting conversation that we recorded at Tech Field Day Extra at Dell Technologies World, or Dell Tech World if you're into the whole brevity thing. And so check that out as well in your podcatcher of choice. You can also find me on Twitter at Mr. Anthropology. That's MR Anthropology. But that will just about do it for the Gestalt IT Rundown for this week. We'll be back next Wednesday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, running down the IT news of the week. For myself, for Tom Hollingsworth, from everyone here at Gestalt IT, here's wishing you and yours to have a super sparkly day. And there's a sheet.